Thank you very much. I'm going to get us going so we stay on schedule. We're in the Lincoln Room, and Abraham Lincoln's giant shadow falls over this whole city. It's nice to be somewhere that calls Lincoln to mind. And the topic for this next panel is bipartisanship, which is not precisely the antithesis of polarization, but something that people, I think, have in mind as absent when they complain about excessive polarization. I'm going to speak very briefly, if I can, because we have three panelists, all of whom will have interesting things to say, I'm sure. We'll start with Marc Johnson, who's a historian, sometimes educator, has passed as an aide and I think press secretary to the governor. He's written many books that are pertinent to the topic. I brought as a prop, but now I see there's an electronic copy here, the most recent one, which I think will be the focus of his comments today, about Mansfield and Dirksen, Everett Dirksen and Mike Mansfield, in the Senate in a period marked by bipartisanship. And so we'll hear first from Mr. Johnson. Then we'll have reflections on the state of bipartisanship, or maybe its absence, in two state legislatures from Senator Shannon Chandley, who has served both in the House and Senate, so she can provide the perspective of two chambers in New Hampshire, and I believe in majority and minority status. And then the senator for the district we are now sitting in, all of us, the 48th in Illinois, Senator Turner, who also has a history of working in local and state government, and so I think maybe we'll be able to talk a little about the degree of bipartisanship in different levels of government, and I think Springfield city government is nonpartisan.
It is.
So nonpartisan as well, allegedly. Well, so there's a wealth of experience and knowledge about partisanship in deliberation and legislative chambers, and I will say no more. I'll turn it to Marc Johnson. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning, everyone. I feel just a little bit intimidated between two powerful state senators, and even more so following Sean's great presentation. I have to publicly, I don't have to, but I want to publicly thank him for the careful review he did for the University of Oklahoma Press of my book on Senators Mansfield and Dirksen, and made great insightful comments that improved the book. And he's a great scholar, as you can tell, and a great teacher, and I'm delighted to be part of this program with him. I also want to acknowledge my friends from the Dirksen Center here, Tiffany White, the director at the Dirksen Congressional Center, and Chris Kiergaard, who's done so much to facilitate our visit here with my wife Trish to Central Illinois, so we're delighted to be here. So why a book about two long dead and mostly forgotten politicians from 50 or 60 years ago? Well, like so many of you, I think, and we've already heard this a bit this morning, I wake up almost every day worried about the direction of our democracy, sometimes even to the point of depression about thinking about it. We are in a very difficult place, it seems to me, and the polarization that has gripped virtually every level now of our political system, from local library districts to the United States Senate, is truly troublesome, because it ignores some of the basic tenets, I think, of how democracy has to function in order to be successful. So I started out wanting to write about Mike Mansfield because he's a remarkable guy. Still, despite Mitch McConnell recently trying to claim the title as the longest serving Senate leader, and it's true, he has been in leadership longer than Mansfield was, Mansfield still holds the record for 16 consecutive years as the Senate Majority Leader, the longest serving Majority Leader in Senate history. And I found, sort of by happenstance in wanting to write about Mansfield, this rather remarkable relationship that he had with the senator from the land of Lincoln, your almost hometown boy, Everett Dirksen. It was not a perfect time by any means. There is no perfect time in American politics. But it was from 1961, when Mansfield became Majority Leader, until Dirksen's death in 1969, I would argue the most productive and most successful bipartisan relationship that has ever existed in the Senate. And the record, frankly, speaks for itself. If you consider the legislation that passed in that period, beginning as the book does with the story of the passage, the Senate ratification of the limited nuclear test ban treaty in 1963, which required the absolute joined at the hip cooperation of Mansfield and Dirksen in order to corral the two-thirds vote needed in the Senate to ratify the treaty, all the way to the Fair Housing Act that passed near the end of Dirksen's life. You see civil rights, voting rights, Medicare, the creation of the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, public television, the Wilderness Act, the first environmental policy acts for clean water and clean air, higher education and secondary education support for the first time. The list goes on and on. It was an awakening for me to realize how extensive the bipartisan support was for that legislation, which is not to say that it wasn't controversial. It often, many pieces were quite controversial. But through a remarkable bit of political leadership on the part of both of these guys, we saw a truly historic, productive period in the United States Senate. So I want to just share a couple of quick slides here, if I can figure out how to advance them.
I promise I won't touch anything.
I've lost my cursor here.
Is the most?
Sorry, Brenda, I lost my cursor.
How did you do that?
I don't know. I think it was the senator's problem here. There we go.
Is this the one?
Yep. So a quick word about these two guys. Dirksen goes to Congress in 1933, one of the very few Republicans elected that year in the Roosevelt landslide of 1932. He moves to the Senate in 1950, almost immediately becomes a major player in the Senate, even though he's in the minority party. Mansfield's elected to Congress for the first time from Montana in 1942 and moves to the Senate in 1952. As I said, by Dirksen's rise to leadership, to becoming the Senate minority leader takes place in 1959, and Mansfield replaces none other than Lyndon Johnson as the majority leader in 1961. Mansfield set out consciously to develop, as Sean was suggesting earlier, a personal relationship with Dirksen. And he admitted early on that the relationship was something of a challenge because Dirksen frankly didn't believe that Mansfield was as genuine as he truly was in striving for that personal relationship. They came from very similar backgrounds and very different personality styles. Hardscrabble upbringing in both cases. Both were World War I veterans, and politics became their life. Dirksen had started out his life as wanting to be an actor. He had written plays, starred in plays. His mother finally had to convince him that there was no future in acting. Economic future in acting at least. So he went into show business by a different means and became a politician. Mansfield was a high school dropout, came back from his military service. As far as I can tell, Mike Mansfield is the only member of the United States Congress who served in 3 different branches of the U.S. military. He lied his way into the United States Navy at age 16 by falsifying his birth documents in order to be able to enlist in the First World War. Later served in the Army and finally in the Marine Corps. You'll notice in the photo he's wearing a lapel pin, which is the Marine Corps emblem, which he was extraordinarily proud of his Marine Corps service, as Dirksen was proud of his service overseas during World War I. So they kind of come together with very different personalities. Dirksen very much a cultivated showman, a great speaker, somebody who loved the limelight. Mansfield, really the polar opposite, disdained publicity, shy, laconic. He was a college history professor, an Asian scholar, and so very, very different personalities. But somehow, during this tumultuous period of the 1960s, they found a way to make the Senate work. You'll find many, many photographs of these guys together. Here's Dirksen at the end of one congressional session calling the White House to inform the president, I believe it must have been Lyndon Johnson, that Congress had adjourned, and here you have Mike Mansfield over his shoulder smiling as Dirksen carries the message to the Democratic president. Replete in their story are occasions when Mansfield would say to members of his own party or the president of his own party, John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, you better check with Dirksen on this. You better see where Dirksen is on this. We need to consult Dirksen on this. The same way Dirksen would say had a particularly close relationship with Lyndon Johnson, dating back to their time in the Senate, and that continued during Johnson's presidency after John Kennedy's assassination. Dirksen would say to LBJ, and we know this because of these recorded telephone calls between Johnson and so many characters that have been, thankfully for historians, archived at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. He would say to Johnson, well, I talked to Mike this morning. And then he would relay Mansfield's view on something that was pending in the Senate. This was a relationship based on so many of the factors that Sean was underscoring just a few minutes ago. Absolute candor, a real commitment to civility, honesty, respect for each other, and a word that Mansfield used over and over again, self-restraint, meaning, I think, that Democrats enjoyed big majorities in the Senate during most of this period. But Mansfield believed that you didn't have to exercise every ounce of power that you had in every circumstance. You didn't need to threaten to filibuster everything that came to the Senate. You could have the power and choose not to use it by exercising self-restraint. All of those characteristics, it seemed to me, add up to a sense of personal character. And there is no substitute for personal character in any walk of life, and maybe particularly in politics. Nothing better demonstrates the relationship than the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Dirksen was absolutely essential in the passage of both of these pieces of legislation. So here you see Dirksen, a great photograph with Martin Luther King, many of the leaders of the civil rights movement, Walter Reuther, the leader of the United Auto Workers, who was a major financial backer of the civil rights movement, and a very young John Lewis, the future congressman from Georgia. So during this period, Mansfield essentially ceded Senate leadership to the Republican. He knew that because of the strong segregationist bloc in the Democratic Party from the South, people like we were talking about earlier, Jim Eastland from Mississippi, Richard Russell from Georgia, that in order to stop a filibuster, end a filibuster, he would need Republican votes. Mansfield knew he would need Republican votes. And he wanted to cultivate an environment where Dirksen could provide the leadership that his Republican colleagues knew he was capable of delivering. So all of the meetings, the strategy sessions leading up to the passage of the Civil Rights and later Voting Rights Act took place in Dirksen's office, the minority leader. He was the guy who was talking to the press every day. He was meeting with the civil rights leadership. Mansfield met with these people too, but you won't find photographs of him because he wanted Dirksen in the spotlight. He knew that the Republican leader needed to convince fellow Republicans to support a Democratic president's initiatives. So think about the context of 1964. John Kennedy has been murdered the previous November. Johnson brings forward the Civil Rights Act. It's an election year. Virtually every Republican believes that the very conservative senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater, is going to be the presidential candidate in the fall, and he's opposed to the Civil Rights Act. So imagine a Republican Senate leader going against the the stated policy position of the presidential candidate of his party and helping a Democratic president get a leg up on a major, major issue of the time. Well, that's what happened with the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Later in 1965, when the Senate is considering the Voting Rights Act, one of Mansfield's staffers comes to him and says, "Boss, the natives are getting restless," meaning Democratic senators are getting restless about all of this attention that is being lavished on Dirksen as the guy who is making, apparently making all the decisions related to the Voting Rights Act. And the aide says to Mansfield, "Can't we just once in a while have a meeting in the majority leader's office where you get to be on TV, you get to set the agenda?" Mansfield looks at him, puffs on his pipe undoubtedly, and says, "No, we're not going to do that. It's really, really important to the country that the American people see the Republican leader of the Senate articulating the need for a Voting Rights Act. That's what we're going to do." So Dirksen brings along 27 of the 33 Republicans in the Senate at that time, stops the filibuster first on the Voting Rights Act, or on the Civil Rights Act, and then later on the Voting Rights Act, and both of those historic pieces of legislation are passed with bipartisan majorities. So it's such a counterpart to the Senate that Sean was describing earlier this morning with his great research. And I would just end with this thought. You know, leadership really does matter. Who is in leadership really does matter. One of Mansfield's closest aides, Francis Vallejo, would later describe his boss's approach to leadership as almost Gandhi-like. He said he practiced the art of nonviolent political engagement. Another aide was asked, well, what is Mansfield's real, what are his politics really? Where is he on the political spectrum? And the aide, Charles Ferris, said, well, someone asked that about the great French military and political leader Charles de Gaulle. And the answer was, de Gaulle is not a man of the right, he's not a man of the left, he is above. And that, I think, is the position that Mansfield held in the Senate with Ev Dirksen. And the relationship transcended pure politics. Again, to Sean's point, it was a personal relationship. You will find in the archives these really touching personal letters between these guys. Mansfield would send Dirksen, who loved flowers, bouquets to his office for no particular reason. He went to a famous candy shop in Butte, Montana called Shepherd's and bought a huge box of candy on one occasion and shipped it to the Dirksens for no apparent reason, just because they had a personal friendship and a relationship, and he was constantly working on that relationship as Dirksen was. One particular anecdote that seems almost incomprehensible given our politics today, there was a kind of a spontaneous ceremony on the Senate floor at one point celebrating Mansfield's birthday. And senator after senator is getting up and extolling his character and his leadership abilities. Dirksen jumps to his feet right in the middle of this and says, "Mike, we love you," right in the middle on the Senate floor. So these enduring qualities of civility, restraint, honesty, candor, respect for your political opponents, respect for every member of the institution, and respect for the institution and the need to make it function really does set these guys apart, and I think makes it worth studying their story, particularly in the context of our time. So to quote the great political commentator Bob Dylan, what we have now are people who are crazy and the times have changed. And we need to figure out a way to get back to a period where character really does count in our politics.
All right, thank you very much. I think Senator Chandley, I'd like to hear your perspectives on bipartisanship in or its absence in New Hampshire from looking in both chambers and historically or in the present, whatever you like.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of the folks who organized this summit. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'd like to thank my fellow panelists because, and certainly listening to Marc's words is inspiring in the sense that I would most certainly agree with him about the importance of building relationships, of building trust, of the importance of good leadership and mentoring in a legislative body. I serve the people of New Hampshire in Senate District 11. For those of you who may not be familiar with New Hampshire politics, it's a wonderful and very interesting place to be. We have our New Hampshire House is 400 members. It is the second largest body in the country next to the federal House of Representatives. Now, we have 400 members in our House, and we have one of the smallest Senates. We have 24 senators. I served 3 terms in the New Hampshire House, and I am in my 2nd term in the Senate. I have been in and I have been out. And I have served in both the majority and the minority in both bodies. So I think I have a pretty broad perspective. I also am a Democrat representing a district that leans Republican. So it is imperative that I recognize that while I am a Democrat and strongly so, when I am represent the Democrats, the Republicans, and all of the undeclareds who are my constituents. And I think that's essential to having effective government and also to participating in a bipartisan, effective way of governing. I think we have to think about what's the job of our legislators. The job is to govern. The job is also to look at the challenges and problems that face us and identify them as problems. We need to agree that that's a problem and then find solutions. And to do that, we have to work together. I want to say that I was struck by the idea that leadership was important because I will say in my experience, the first time I ran, it was to be a representative in a district that had 8 folks representing that district. So there were, the first time, I think there were 16 of us on the ballot, 8 Democrats, 8 Republicans, and 7 Republicans and I were elected to represent the district. So next morning, phone rings, first call, the person congratulating me. The second congratulatory call I got was from one of the people that I would then be serving with, who was a Republican. From that point forward, there were three of us who carpooled together whenever we could, 2 Republicans and me, and sometimes there was a fourth person who was a Democrat from a different district. But it was really, I think that's important to think about. They reached out to me immediately. I had just been elected to serve the same district as they, and I do that with the people who serve my district. Now that I'm a senator, I try to reach out to all of the representatives who serve in the towns that I do. I also had the good fortune of being, when I was assigned to a committee, I had a wonderful chair who was a Democrat and the ranking Republican member who demonstrated every single day how to work together. They were wonderful mentors to me, and they showed how you can work together and perhaps disagree on a number of issues, but not necessarily they didn't demonize each other. They didn't paint each other as the enemy. Those 2 men were my mentors in many ways, and then a couple of years later, things changed. The man who had been the Republican ranking member was then the chair, and I was assigned to that committee as the ranking Democratic committee member. So that history we had built to work together continued, and we were able to create the best product for the people of New Hampshire, because in fact, that's what we as legislators do, is create our product, our laws and policies. I can talk about a lot of different issues. I don't want to take up too much time. I want to give Senator Turner a chance to speak, and then maybe we can answer some questions as you see fit.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you to talk about this issue. It's something that I'm very, very interested in. I have had the great honor to serve in 3 different levels of government. I was on the Sangamon County Board for 10 years, and while in that body, there were 29 of us, and there were 5 Democrats. So when you talk about have to work in a bipartisan fashion, yeah, that was me. But one of the things, and that was my first elective office, and one of the things that I really learned from that experience was I was there to represent my district, and the only way that I could be successful in that is if I learned to work with my colleagues. That was extremely important. I think that we have to get back to a place where we can govern and disagree, but not be disagreeable, and understand that every fight is not the last fight. There'll be other things that will come along. I had the honor of speaking to a group of Illinois women in leadership, and the last thing that I said to them was, please remember that in this business, there are 2 things that you have, and that you have to really guard and cherish, and that's your word and relationships. In order to be successful, I think both of those, basically come together. So I left the Sangamon County Board and moved to the Springfield City Council, which was nonpartisan, so they say. But when I came to that body, I was in the minority again. So, it's that just kind of followed me, didn't it? And then I moved to the Illinois State Senate. And this was the first time that I actually had the pleasure of working in a supermajority. However, if you look at the legislation that I've passed, and I have to say that I have been extremely successful in sending pieces of legislation to the governor that he has signed. And if you look at every piece of that legislation, it's bipartisan. Because when you are seeking to serve your constituents, you're looking for issues that are significant, issues that are going to leave a lasting a lasting piece of work and make a lasting difference. And that's not Democrat positions, it's not Republican positions, it's where we all, come together. And those are good positions that are for the betterment of everybody that you're serving. I have a colleague, and her name is, believe it or not, Sally Turner. And she represents a district that is just to the north of mine. We kind of butt against each other. And believe it or not, my son was in the Sally Turner district for a little bit. And so we have a lot and so we call ourselves the Turner Caucus in the Senate. And I have a colleague that's in the House, and his last name is Smith. And he told me, he says, I can't believe this. There's never been 2 Smiths in the General Assembly, and now you have 2 Turners. So funny story, when I came into the Senate February 6th of 2021, there was a vacancy, and I was appointed. And she came in just a little bit, maybe a couple of months before I did, there was a vacancy, and she was appointed. And so, you're still learning, protocol, learning things. And so, of course, a bill is read 3 times before it gets passed. And so, and on the second reading, they basically say the name of the sponsor, the bill number, and then you just make a motion of whether you want to move the bill or whether you don't. So, I was talking to my seatmate I wasn't paying attention. I was talking to my seatmate, and so they say, you know, Turner, whatever, and so I go like this to move it, and then I look up and it's Sally Turner. So I'm like, no, 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 it's her, you know, it's her. But so we actually, the Turner Caucus has been extremely successful in moving bills, and that one of the reasons is because they are good bills that really serve the public well. And I think that that's what we all strive for. I also, besides being in elective office, I worked in state government for 32 years. I started when I was like 4. And retired from the Illinois Department of Public Health after 22 years. And, you know, you have to understand and recognize that when you're passing legislation, there's a reason why you're passing it. And it has to then filter down to be enacted. You know, people have to, you know, do what the legislation says. So if there's all this strife and discord while the legislation is being discussed and passed, and then it continues even after either the governor or president has signed that legislation, do you realize how hard it is for whoever is supposed to then put it into action, how hard it is for that governing part? So it's not just, you know, the legislature. That governing goes down to those agencies, whether it be at the local, state, or federal level, that have to enact that legislation. So when you have all of this strife and discord at that top level, it just makes it that much more difficult for it to be enacted, which means that the people that you are representing are the ones that suffer. We had a situation in the General Assembly where we talked about and passed legislation that dealt with criminal justice reform. And it was a piece of it was several pieces of legislation that were packaged together. And one of those pieces of legislation was around no cash bail. And I will say, I don't want to get into the merits of the legislation. That's not important right now. But what is important is the terrible, terrible debates that were had on the floor around it, that then, even after the governor signed the legislation, those individuals that were put in a position of then enacting that legislation continued to debate how terrible the legislation was, which made it that much more difficult for it to go into effect, which means that it wasn't the legislators that passed the legislation. It wasn't those people that continued to keep ginning it up. It was the people that were really supposed to be served by the legislation that suffered. So, you know, we have to continue to remember that. There is an African proverb that says, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. So we have to remember that when we conduct ourselves, and I will say legislators, you know, all the way down, when we conduct ourselves in a manner that is such, you know, rife with discourse, it's the people that we are supposed to be elected to serve are the ones that are actually suffering. And I think that if people who are in elected positions remember that, then hopefully we could get back to the days that you talked about where we had a lot more bipartisanship in our legislative bodies.
Thank you very much. All of the presenters were very concise, so we have time for questions. We have about 20 minutes, and I'm sure they'll all be happy to take questions. There's a microphone, but it's not that large a room. I think anyone who speaks loudly probably can be heard. I'll be the question moderator. So Laurel, please.
So thank you all so much for your comments and remarks. So I was thinking about arguments by a political scientist, Francis Lee, who's argued that, at least in the context of the U.S. Congress, one of the big changes over time that has kind of disincentivized bipartisanship or cooperation is the competition, or at least the perceived competition, for majority control. And that the thought being that if you think that you're likely to be able to, go from minority status to majority status in the next election cycle, you don't have incentives to help the other side look good. And I was thinking a lot about, Mark, your comments about the Mansfield-Dirksen relationship and their kind of, even though they were kind of willingness to go against the presidential candidate and kind of help the Democrats with something, would that have been different if the Republicans thought they could have won majority in the Senate as well? And so I guess kind of just as a question to all of you, I guess, does that ring true? Does if someone's more in a permanent minority, which on the one hand seems worse for representation or kind of competition, does that actually increase the odds of bipartisanship and a more robust competition actually reduce the opportunities?
I'm happy to speak to that. Understanding that what you're talking about is mostly about perception of Congress, and I think that is possibly spot on. But the way I look at it is, if we are participating, I'm currently in the minority, I still want to do the best for our state because Senator Turner used the word serve frequently, and I think that is completely the way I approach, and I think the best legislators approach government being elected as we are public servants and we are in service to the people. If we are trying to do what's best for our state, I want the people of my state to be living the best life possible. I want my state to be doing well, and I'm going to support any good ideas that come forward. There is no, there's no winning in being obstructionist. I'm not saying it never happens in state government, it certainly can, but I don't see it that way, and I think good legislators don't see it that way. It does not make any sense. One of the things I'll mention, we talk about, there can be danger in the supermajority because if it's easy to pass everything you want, you may not be looking at it as critically as one needs to. And it's difficult to be in the minority, and sometimes you can feel when you are in the minority that you have very little, for lack of a better term, power or influence. This year, our budget passed under very interesting circumstances. So currently, our House is incredibly closely divided. It is, of the 400 members, there are, I believe, and I could be off by one or two at this point, there are 3 undeclareds, people who had been elected from either the Republican or the Democratic Party and have disassociated with that party. So we have, I believe it's 3 undeclareds, and approximately 196 Democrats and maybe 197 Republicans. And there is one election, a special election coming up. So suffice to say, it's closely divided. The Senate is 14-10. Republican, Democrat. So you would think the Democrats in the Senate wouldn't have a lot to say in the budget process. But because of those close numbers in the House, there was real incentive for Republican senators and Democratic senators to work together to craft a budget that could go to the House and be acceptable to the majority of both parties. So it really led to us working together, and there would have been no advantage. Maybe there would have been political advantage. Maybe some people would have seen it as politically advantageous to make it impossible to pass a budget, but how horrible would that have been for the people of our state? So I think the better side of all of us prevailed, and we were able to pass what is I can think is probably the most successful kind of budget that one passes, one that we can all live with, but none of us is thrilled with. It's something that, there's more we could have wanted in it, from it, but it worked. So.
I just make 2 quick observations that I think are relevant, at least at the federal level, to your question. One is the ideological sorting of the parties that Sean illustrated so effectively this morning. Is a disincentive, I think, to bipartisanship, to trying to find a middle ground. when your parties are, basically to the left and to the right and farther left all the time, it seems like. There is a disincentive to work toward the middle. The other is the reality that every 2 years, control of Congress is on the ballot. And particularly true in the Senate, every United States Senate race is now a national race. So you're seeing a contest in Montana next year, in Ohio, where the fate of who controls the Senate is going to be decided by a handful of races that become nationalized. So finding a way for a senator like Jon Tester in Montana, who is about as authentic a Montanan as you can imagine. I mean, this guy's a farmer, only farmer in the Senate, I think, to cut through that national debate about who's going to control the Senate and make the case that he's a good representative for the people of Montana is a real task, because all of these races are so completely nationalized now.
And I think that sometimes people think that if you serve in a supermajority like we have right now in Illinois in both chambers, that there is not a lot of discussion and not a lot of discourse. And there actually is, because even though in the Senate I'm in the supermajority and I'm Democrat, there are a lot of different divergent voices within that caucus. And everybody is not just, in lockstep saying, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And, we represent very different districts that have different needs and different constituencies. So, for instance, I am one of two black senators that represent areas outside of, the Chicago metro area. So my constituents are very different from my Chicago colleague constituents. And so when I'm in caucus, I'm speaking out with regard to, those constituents and the needs of my district. So there are even in, caucuses that are in the supermajority, there are a lot of divergent voices that are, having those same kinds of conversations and arguments, for lack of a better word. Sometimes caucus can get pretty ruckus.
One quick little anecdote too about the difference between the Dirksen-Mansfield era and ours. I think 25, maybe 28 states at various times in the 1960s had senators from both political parties, including Illinois. Mm-hmm. So the majority of states were represented by a Republican and a Democrat in the Senate. Now, what is it, Sean? 5 states, I think, that have a senator from each of the parties. So again, another disinclination to work across the partisan divide. It's been said, of course, that the most difficult relationship in politics is between 2 senators from the same state, without regard to their partisanship. There's a great anecdote in the book about Dirksen, when Chuck Percy, a Republican, comes to the Senate for replacing a Democrat, who Dirksen did not really have a very close relationship with a Democrat, but he had a particularly kind of wary relationship with Percy, a member of his own party. A reporter at one point asked Dirksen, he says, "So would it be safe to say that you're ambivalent about Senator Percy?" Dirksen said, "Well, you might say that." He said, "Well, that means that sometimes you like him and sometimes you're not that crazy about him." Dirksen says, "Yeah, you get the point."
I know, and along those lines, I would say as well, a lot of the things that you hear said, that colleagues from across the aisle will say, a lot of that is for show. I mean, I have had colleagues that will say some very outlandish things on the floor, and then 5 minutes later they're coming over, "I'm really sorry, I didn't mean for it to come out that way," that kind of thing. So just keep that in mind as well. There is a lot of conversations and back and forth, and concessions that happen outside of the public view that really lend themselves to bills being passed that may not look like they're bipartisan, but they really are because, you have worked your colleagues' concerns into your legislation.
Two questions over here. Let's start with the front. And then
Sure. Some of your comments have already started to touch on this. I'm interested in your observations about the nationalization of local and state politics, issues that are kicked from the federal government down to the states and local levels, as well as issues that state and local have no discretion over, but are nonetheless part of the campaigns and the politics of those lower levels. And related to this, as a Wisconsinite, appreciative that Illinois is available for women who are seeking abortion care, because we don't have that in Wisconsin. So that's one of these issues that is suddenly really hot in state politics.
Well, yeah, there's a whole national infrastructure now that didn't exist even 25 years ago, or certainly didn't exist 50 years ago, that is seeking to make issues national and hot button social issues most dominant. So that's, getting, as I indicated earlier, down to the library district level, county commission level, city council level, where, the big debates used to be which mayor could do the best job of getting the snow removed. Now it's, a whole hot button package of social issues that get inserted into these local campaigns and local elections. Again, I think a very troubling aspect of what's happened to our sense of, as Senator Turner said so well, the idea that you get elected to these jobs because you want to try to do something that improves the lives of the people that you're elected to represent. And that gets lost so much of the time in these, really rancorous debates about, which books are going to be banned from libraries, or whether healthcare services for women who really, in some cases, desperately need them, many cases desperately need them, are going to be available. So, yeah, it's just part of the whole nationalization of our politics at every level.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's unfortunate because it does take away from the conversations that need to be had at the local level, and it also puts a real drain on the fiscal implications of local government, because there are certain things that local governments are designed to do, and pretty close, get the snow removed, get the branches picked up, keep things like that, moving along. But as we nationalize, down to the local level, we see where local governments have to start making fiscal preparations for all of those things to happen. And we see it in Chicago now and in other cities where, they're sending buses of immigrants to cities, just kind of on a willy-nilly basis. And so you have, a city that is already having fiscal problems just because, and now you have to find, upwards of $300 or $400 million for a situation that has to be taken care of right now. And that, that's played out in Chicago on a larger level, but you see it played out across a lot of different cities and locations. So, for instance, when you talk about the issue of women and reproductive health care, that's a national issue that came floating down. But then even on the local level, you see where law enforcement, more money has to be put into law enforcement budgets because of the things that they have to watch out for and be on notice about. So it really does have a significant impact on our most, local governments in a lot of different ways. And unfortunately, the fiscal perspective is one that really kind of sticks out.
And I guess all I would add to what has been said is that there's the negative consequence of national organizations, advocacies, or parties driving some of the discussion and legislation at the state level can be quite difficult and devastating to communities in a number of ways, and also incite certain amounts of rancor that were not there, because issues being raised by some of these advocacy groups are issues that were not being considered in those states until they were sort of brought in by outside influences. On the other hand, I do think that there are national issues that because of a lack of, whether it's because of gridlock or other issues, there are other causes, there are issues that come to the states that we do need to deal with. I think reproductive health care is an excellent example, because living in New Hampshire, in our state, that I did not expect this would be a prominent issue in New Hampshire when I was first elected. But of course, with the Supreme Court decision, it became important. Actually, prior, New Hampshire had not had the first modern abortion ban in New Hampshire occurred in the recently, and right now we in the state are trying to at least say that there are many of us working to ensure that say that women do have an affirmative right to abortion health care prior to the 24-week ban, because we don't even have that. But we need to now have these kinds of statements because of the actions at the federal level. And then finally, the last point I'd make about this is there are issues like marriage equality, which were not being addressed at the federal level, that the states were able to lead the charge. New Hampshire was, we passed marriage equality back in 2009. In 2009, that was a very new, a really bold statement by the state of New Hampshire. And at that time, the 4 states that had marriage equality were, I believe, Massachusetts and Iowa, which had not done it legislatively as well. And then legislatively, Vermont was just a few weeks before New Hampshire, I believe. So the states can take on those issues that then drive the national conversation as well.
We're almost out of time. I did actually identify one question, so if it's quick enough, we'll try to get that in and then we'll stop.
Okay. How do you balance the needs of the people with outside influences from lobbyists and lobbyist organizations, which can often differ from what your constituents want?
In 30 seconds.
Okay, so in New Hampshire, one of the things I can say that we are different in that our pay structure is very different. We are paid $100 a year. So no one is in this position to earn an income. And that's a whole other big discussion we could have, different topic. But for me, I meet regularly with lobbyists, and I learn from them their positions, and I listen to their advocacy. And I do that across the board. And I think most legislators in New Hampshire are happy to speak with lobbyists and learn from them. But our relationships are very, very different. We have strict ethical guidelines that are followed, and they're a source of information. Lobbyists are a source of information for us.
I think excuse me, I think I would agree, but I am very active out in my district. And so I really feel like that it's a legislator's job to not stay in your office and wait for lobbyists and people to come to you. It's your job to get out and talk to your constituents. So, so I think that gives me a little bit different perspective, because I do have that ability and they have, you know, they have my ear. But I think that lobbyists play a role because you're finding out things that you would not ordinarily know, but just keep in mind, you have lobbyists coming in that are proponents for something, but you also have lobbyists coming in that are opponents. So, you know, you're looking at it from an educational perspective, but, you know, I always keep in mind who I'm there to represent and, you know, hope that I always make the best decision for my constituencies.
All right, we have to come off there. Those are very good final words, I think. Thank you very much.
Hey, Brian, for just shameless self-promotion, my friend Chris from the Dirksen Center has a few copies of the book if anybody is interested in obtaining one. Thanks for the commercial.
It's a very good read.
Okay, shameless self-promotion, you're in the 48, spend a lot of money.
Don't spend it right now because we're coming back for